So I'm happy to tell you some good news today, a few snippets from my forthcoming book, The Moral Arc, How Science and Reason Lead Humanity Toward Truth, Justice, and Freedom. The title inspiration comes from, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his second most famous speech after the I Have a Dream speech, his How Long speech. He had a series of rhetorical questions of how long it will take before we achieve freedom and justice. And as he famously said in his last refrain, not long because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So what I want to argue today, what I argue in my book, is using science in two ways. One, we can use science to track the fact that there is an arc to the moral universe, and it is bending toward justice, and I add truth and freedom. And that science and reason is the primary driver behind pushing the arc toward truth, justice, and freedom. In fact, 4 months after Dr. King gave this famous speech, the Voting Rights Act was voted into Congress and signed by President Johnson in August of 1965. So that's some moral progress right there. But that, in fact, was just one of the latest of the rights revolutions that had been unfolding for 2 centuries. Here I track, and what I'm going to present is a series of graphs and data sets from my book. So these are the number of states that have abolished slavery and criminalized its practice. In virtually every country of the world today, it is illegal to practice slavery. We've won that battle. You no longer have to make the argument that slavery is immoral. It's just illegal. And it's still practiced in a few areas, so I have the dotted lines up there. But we've made much progress in that area. One of the reasons for this is that democracies are less likely to tolerate things like slavery. And so we can track the number of liberal democracies. In 1900, there were actually 0 liberal democracies, not one. Now there's about 118 out of the 182 countries that have full voting rights for all citizens. This is the graph of the Polity scale. The Polity Project rates democracies on a scale of 1 to 10. So instead of saying, is this country a democracy or is it not a democracy, in a binary choice, and then which you get in fights with scholars over whether it's a democracy or not, you just rank it on a scale of its openness, its transparency, fairness, how many people have the franchise, how much money influences votes, corruption, and things like that. America, by the way, is about an 8 on the 1 to 10 scale, so we're not perfect. But as you can see, so many more countries now than before are democracies. Women attained the vote in 1920 in the United States. You can see the track here. We were kind of late in coming, basically, after a number of other countries had already gotten there. But after the First World War, then there was a burst of countries to give women the franchise. Interestingly, if you see on the left there, Pitcairn Islands, the Island of Man, Cook Islands, and New Zealand. It seemed like islands were pioneering women's rights to vote. Saudi Arabia apparently will be the last one sometime in 2015, it's projected. And interestingly, Vatican City, never. That gives us a clue as to what drives moral progress and what withholds retards moral progress. How does moral progress happen? In part, it happens from great leaders and champions and people that just stand up for their rights. I introduce you here to the magnificent Inez Milholland, who I feature in my book, in her 1913 march on Washington, D.C., in which she led tens of thousands of women, and it still took 7 years after that. But there's nothing like marching into D.C. on a white stallion to make your point. In fact, women have tracked quite a bit of progress in women's rights. Here are the percentage of 25 to 32-year-olds with at least a 4-year college degree. So women surpassed men in about 1995 and have been making gains ever since. Here's the women's earnings as a percent of men's. It was 67% in 1980. It's now 93% in 2012. Here's the relationship. This is a very controversial subject. I have a whole section on what happens when you give women reproductive rights. And so as you give women reproductive rights and contraceptive use goes up, abortion rates and fertility rates go down. So I make the argument that even if you're a Christian, conservative, pro-life, anti-abortionist, the best thing you can do is give women the rights to, and access to contraception and especially education. As a bonus, populations go down. This particular data set is from South Korea, but I have many other data sets from other countries as well. This is called the comparative method. You compare one country to another when they vary their laws and social conditions, and then you can do experiments that way. So we're in the midst of another rights revolution, gay rights and same-sex marriage. These kinds of signs are much rarer than they used to be, thankfully. This is the attitudes of citizens of the United States through different data sets. The General Social Survey and Gallup. Should gay marriage be legal? Should gays have equal opportunity? And you can see the trend lines are moving up from the 70s until today. Here is changing attitudes. So those favoring gays and lesbians having same-sex marriage being legal crossed the line there in about 2011. Actually, this is one of those charts and sections in my book that I'm in the stage of proofing galleys, and I have to change the number of states like every month. That it keeps us, as soon as my book is published, it will be out of date on this particular rights revolution. We can see who's leading the revolution. The younger you are, the more likely you are to support gay marriage. The older you are, the less likely you are to support that. Nevertheless, the trend lines are all still going up. So the younger generation is pulling everybody up with it. I make the argument that a lot of pop culture, films, TV shows, things like that, people coming out. The coming out campaign is a big driver behind that. And we can see who resists this and who supports it. Religiously unaffiliated, the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. The nuns are the fastest growing religious cohort in America. 1 out of 5, 20% are nuns. Religiously unaffiliated are unabashedly supporting gay marriage. White evangelical Protestants are the least likely to support it. In fact, their support has been going down. Actually, that will kick up a bit in 2014. And by the way, I have some good news for you. If, like me, you favor gay marriage and the legalization of marijuana, I have found biblical support for both. In Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13, it says, if a man lies with another man, he must be stoned. So if you're arguing with your religious friends, you can pull out the Bible and show them that scripture. Legal torture is now illegal in pretty much every country in the world. The United States doesn't practice torture. We have enhanced interrogation techniques. So yes, of course, the progress is checkered and it's modified slightly, but that's a real strong trend line of the abolition of legalized torture by states. Here is the death penalty is now on death row. These are the various techniques states used in the past to execute citizens, including the very first illustration ever found in the upper right corner there, the earliest of about probably at least 10,000 years old. Hunter-gatherers have executed probably a bully or a murderer, somebody who was bad. So there's 10 archers and 10 arrows in the guy on the ground there, and the various other techniques. The death penalty is now on death row. In Europe, it's not practiced at all. Even in the United States, this is the graph tracking U.S. death sentences by year. So it went up during the crime wave, and then after the crime wave peaked in the late 90s and collapsed after that, the number of U.S. death sentences and then actual executions. Most prisoners on death row die of old age. That's the fate of it. It still goes on, Florida and Texas, but we're getting there again. The graphs are going in the right direction. Homicides are on the decline. Here is the rates of homicides in a number of different European countries. Criminologists study rates of homicides per 100,000. In the Middle Ages, it was about 100 per 100,000. In Europe today, it's less than 1 per 100,000. That's a 100-fold decrease in homicides. You are 100 times safer now than you would have been living in Europe in the Middle Ages. In America, it's about 5.2, mainly because of drug-related gun crimes in inner cities. Otherwise, we're pretty safe, just like Europe. Rates of violence and percentages of death in warfare. These are just a couple of skeletons we have from archaeological sites. This particular data set is about 50 different data sets on one graph. On the left there, you see archaeological sites of prehistoric sites and how people lived and died. In the middle, you see modern hunter-gatherers communities and their rates of death violent death in warfare. And on the second from the right, you see modern horticulturalists, and then on the far right, you see states. The likelihood that you would die violently living in one of those four communities is far lower in states than it is in prehistoric hunter-gatherer communities or modern hunter-gatherer communities. In other words, it's much better to be alive today than any time in the past. If you were a young male, you had about a 1 in 4 chance of dying violently if you lived as a hunter-gatherer. These are the good old days. You do not want to go back in time in a time machine and live in one of those communities. It's a very dangerous place to be. Terrorism and other forms of political violence. We have a new data set that was just published last year by the political scientist Erica Chenoweth, in which she tracked thousands of conflicts and violent versus nonviolent forms of political agitation and change from 1900 all the way through the present. What she showed is on the left there is the percentage of successful campaigns, violent versus nonviolent. So successful nonviolent far out, more than 2 to 1 over violent campaigns. And on the right, failures were much more likely to be the result of violent versus nonviolent campaigns. And you can see the trend lines here. Since the heyday of hijacked planes and terrorist bombings in the 60s and 70s, the rate of successful violent groups has been going down. Rate of successfully overturning a state or achieving your political goals has been going down. Violence is not the way to achieve political change. Still goes on. People will still attempt it. But we have now data sets, extensive data sets on terrorist organizations and their use of violence. Not one terrorist organization in history has ever overturned a state. It's never happened. And not one terrorist group has ever achieved all of their political goals. Some have achieved 1 or 2, but that's it. So even that is a form of progress. How far is the moral arc bent? Today's conservatives are more liberal than liberals were in the 1950s. Just think about that for a moment. I'm talking social attitudes, not economic attitudes here. Social attitudes. Just think about the honeymooners where Ralph Cramden used to threaten to hit his wife and knock her to the moon. This was funny in the 50s. And that's not fun anymore. You can't make jokes about spousal abuse as being funny anymore. That's the kind of shift that's happened just gradually enough that we don't really notice it until all of a sudden everybody's been pulled along without even realizing that they've changed. And pop culture, television shows, films, novels, books, magazines, and so forth are how that social change happens, how that zeitgeist, how that worldview changes. Recall the episode on homosexuality in Seinfeld, where they were all denying that they were gay, not that there's anything wrong with that. That would not have been said in the 1950s. Or just think about the owner of the Clippers, Donald Sterling. Most old guys in the 50s thought like he thinks now. It's moral progress, the fact that he's immediately condemned for those kinds of attitudes. Why is the moral arc bent toward justice? Well, my thesis is that the moral sphere has been expanding, the expanding moral sphere. That is, who we consider to be honorary members of our tribe, our clan, our family, and so forth. So evolutionary theory explains the inner white circles. We should be nice to our kin and kind. In other words, the first moral principle is be kind and help your kin and kind. That's not hard to explain through selfish gene theory. And the second moral principle of reciprocity or reciprocal altruism, I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. That takes care of everybody that we're related to or that we know, but how do you expand to people that you don't know, that you're not related to, people in other tribes and so on? That takes science and reason. That is, it takes the ability to think about somebody in a different way. So I call that Enlightenment humanism. It began with the Enlightenment philosophers who self-consciously modeled their attempts to understand society, politics, economics, and political systems and how we should live together in a scientific way. They self-consciously modeled themselves after Newton and Galileo and so forth, and made an attempt. They started us down the road toward social science. And I claim that scientific thinking is more abstract, and abstract reasoning is what expands the evolutionary circle of sentiments. Let me introduce you to an interesting idea called the Flynn effect. You may have heard of this. This was discovered by a psychologist named James Flynn, that IQ scores are going up 3 points every 10 years for about a century. That is to say, people today are about 2 standard deviations smarter than they were a century ago. That's huge. That's gigantic. It's amazing. But not just on all the IQ subtests. Not on the tests like arithmetic and vocabulary and information, things that you can study for and memorize. It's on the types of questions that require abstract reasoning, like the matrices where you have to rotate those figures in space and imagine what they're going to be like folded 3 more times, or pick the one that goes in the next pattern. Or similarities, like this is to that as this is to, and then you have to pick the answer. For some reason, we're getting better at reasoning abstractly. And abstract reasoning is what moral reasoning is all about. The golden rule of my putting myself into your shoes means I have to transform myself into your brain and imagine what the world looks like through your eyes and how you would feel, how I would feel if I were you, if this happened to me, and so forth. That requires rotating things in space. That requires abstract reasoning. This is a controversial idea. The Flynn effect itself, what's the cause of it? Is it technology? Is it computers? It happened before that. Is it diet and nutrition? Probably not. It's not just the fact that we're better at taking tests, because the effect is started before mass test taking. So it just has to do with how society has shifted from agriculture to industry to information. So what I'm claiming is that we're becoming more moral as people. Our brains are getting better wired. So for example, we've discovered through research that back to that inner circle versus the outer circle, who you should cooperate with and who you should not cooperate with. This is a famous experiment by Fair and Gachter. It's a common goods game where everybody around a table is given a sum of money, and then you voluntarily and anonymously put in an envelope some or all of your money, and then the whole pot is multiplied by 1.5 and divided evenly among the members at the table. And nobody knows who gave how much, but we can all see that we've all gained a little bit. So what happens is that everybody puts in most of their money at the start, and then somebody gets the idea, well, since this is anonymous, I'll just put in $9 instead of $10, and I'll still get a slight edge over everybody else. And then the moment everybody sees that somebody's free riding a little bit, they all start to free ride, and the whole system collapses. Unless you add a second condition, the with punishment condition, in which everybody has transparency, we know how much each of you gave, and we have the opportunity to punish you for free riding, that is, if you skimp out. So we know that we need a shadow of enforcement. People are nice when they have rules. Now, this is one of the roles of religion. One of the reasons for the evolution of religion is to enforce the rules. And the Leviathan state is the other way. So Thomas Hobbes' book Leviathan is probably the most influential and famous political treatise ever written. Thomas Hobbes said himself, I am the Galileo of society. I am the William Harvey of society. Consciously modeled himself after the physical and biological sciences. Basically arguing that we can go from particles in motion in the universe to why you should have a social contract in which you give up your rights to a state, a Leviathan, in order to have more freedoms. We know that this actually works to a certain extent. The fact that we have to have rules means that it decreases incentives for exploitative attack. It reduces the need for deterrence and vengeance. It replaces self-help justice with criminal justice and replaces a culture of honor with a culture of civility. This is why Justitia has these accoutrements. She has a blindfold, so she's fair in her assessment of what happened. She has the scales of fair justice, and she has the sword to enforce the rules. Without that, society breaks down. The problem is Leviathan states can turn into nasty dictatorships in which states become even more violent than violent non-state societies. And so the democratic peace theory was first proffered by Immanuel Kant, again, another natural philosopher who we would today call a scientist, but they didn't call themselves that time. 3 things you need for better peace. Basically, the democratic peace theory is democracy, trade, and membership in international communities. This was put to the test by Bruce Russett and John O'Neill in 2001, their book Triangulating Peace. They used the Correlates of War project, in which they took 2,300 militarized interstate disputes from 1816 to 2001, plus the Polity project, I showed you the slide, of ranking democracies, assigned each country a democracy score of 1 to 10, and then crunched the numbers. Basically, when the less democratic member of a pair leaned toward autocracy, or disputes increased by 100%. When both countries were fully democratic, that is, if you were an 8 or higher on the polity scale, you were 50% less likely to have a conflict. So as democracy increases, violence decreases. And so this is what it looks like. So the number of conflicts between major powers has collapsed since the Second World War, and the number of disputes has gone down. As you can see in the dotted line there, as democracies goes up and autocracies go down. Now, again, it's not zero. There's always going to be conflicts, but we're looking at overall statistical trends. The second vertices and Kant's triangle is trade, or gentle commerce. Plunder is zero-sum. Trade is non-zero. It's win-win. So in other words, other people become more valuable alive than dead. We could invade Canada and take all that nickel they have up there by Toronto. Or we can just buy it. It's a lot cheaper to just buy it than invade. Wars are too expensive. And trade also has another benefit, the hockey stick of wealth. That's the last 2,000 years of world GDP per capita in 1990 US dollars. Here's the projection through 2030. So basically doubling the world per capita GDP. The little dip in there is the financial crisis of 2008 and 9. Just a tiny little dip. If you held on to your 401k, it's probably right back up to where it was. And these are projections for the 21st century. That's the increase in growth of world GDP per capita in the 21st century will be more than all other centuries combined. And in case you're worried about income inequality and the poor, the percentage of the world's population living in poverty and extreme poverty as defined by the UN, $2.50 a day, $1.25 a day for poverty and extreme poverty. Those rates are collapsing, as you can see on this graph. By 2050, they should be to zero. And finally, on that income inequality, I know there's much discussion about that. These are the 5 quintiles, the 4 on the left, and then the top quintile, the 5th there, is broken up into 4 parts on the right. Yes, the rich are getting richer faster than everybody else is getting richer, but notice what the 4 to the left quintiles are not getting. They're not getting poorer. They're getting richer. They're getting 49% richer, 37% richer, 36% richer, and 45% richer. Okay, so this is good news. Not that we don't have any problems, not that people are not resentful, not that there aren't issues, but this is a good news story. You put all those together then, democracy, trade, and membership in international governmental organizations. In other words, transparency. Evil happens in secret. So Russett and O'Neill put all of these together, and a pair of countries that are in the top 10th of the scale in all 3 variables, trade, democracy, and membership in international intergovernmental organizations, were 83% less likely than an average pair of countries to have a militarized dispute in any given year. So here's a scientific way of understanding the cause of effects that we want, that is, less violence and so forth. And that's the number of international governmental organizations. There's the trifecta of peace. Comparative method. North Korea and South Korea had the same GDP per capita of $854 in 1950. South Korea, a democracy that has trade and membership in governmental organizations. Average GDP is $19,600 versus that of South Korea of $1,100. That's a 1,750% raise they got. So it works. You can also see it in their height. South Koreans are about 3 inches taller than North Koreans. And then that's the satellite picture from space, South Korea versus North Korea.
Thank you very much for
Thank you.
That was a whirlwind of data, ideas, and this is where my journalistic hat kicks in. We've only got a couple of minutes. I hope everybody's having a great time. We were just inventing the timeline as we go today because we're nowhere near what we should be. But when I look at something like the timeline of democracies, or here democracies are better, here or this, I often wonder, particularly when we're thinking about the theme today of sages and scientists of trying to look at the struggle in science and the struggle, spiritually, the struggle to make the world a better place. To me, the struggle seems important. And I, to be quite honest, I sort of think that there's a formulaic dimension in what we saw, where recently the cover story, the best-selling cover of The Atlantic, happened 2 months ago, was Ta-Nehisi Coates on the subject of reparations. And if you read that, you see a century not of an easy democracy that abolished slavery, but a nation that created slavery by other means and found ways to hide it and continued to exploit people and find things. And I think that talking about that, discussing that, acknowledging it, helps you get to a better place, but I don't think that 1964 was the be-all of solving that problem, and I think that he makes a very good case, or even after, the Gettysburg Address, et cetera, as we know. And so how important is the struggle as opposed to checking off the box? Because when you look at the world, I've been commenting every day on the horrors with James Foley and what just happened abroad, and you kind of look at the rise of a kind of uninformed, pugnacious nationalism in the United States, but that's happening everywhere in the world. And it seems to be running against some of the trends you said, even inside countries that have already checked off the wealth box and the so-called democracy box. So do you play with that a little bit?
Yep, that's a super good question. It's, the problem we face here is that our brains are designed to note the exceptions, the emotionally salient events, the beheading of somebody, and so on, and think, wow, things are bad and getting worse. The reason we need science is to have the long-term trend lines. It's like global warming deniers that go, what are you talking about global warming? It was cold yesterday. They're confusing a single anecdote, the weather, with a long-term trend. So we have to have these long-term trends. My argument is that science is the key to getting us to understand the causes of these things. So the progress I've tracked is not willy-nilly random, let's try this, let's try that. There's been a systematic effort on the part of social scientists to understand, well, what actually causes wealth to go up, what causes violence to go down. So policing, for example, they're using this CompuPolice system, in which they know if like a crime happens on this corner, a crime is 50% more likely to happen on this corner, so you put police there before it happens as a preventative measure. Those are the kinds of things we can do, and you can do that politically. This is why we have this sort of bizarre foreign policy. Let's send troops over there. It's like the CompuPolice. We're doing that as a preventative measure. Of course, there will always be acts of violence. That will never stop, so there's enough of those to fill the evening news every night. So all of us watching it go, wow, things are grim and getting worse, when in fact, when you look at the trends, they're actually getting better.
Kira, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just, on the theme of SAGE and scientists, we're hearing about so much science, right? But you're mentioning, that right now we're living in the most moral period in our history. And you're talking about we're the most moral, we are more moral now as people. Considering our group here, faith, belief in a higher power, spirituality, does that impact that at all? Because, we have grown up, we have studied, the traditions are morality and faith are
matter.
They matter.
Yep. Well, okay, so on balance, separating religion from spirituality. Religion has been a force for both good and evil, clearly, but on balance, it's science that's pushing the arc. Religions tend to drag behind it. You could just watch it like with the gay marriage. You could just see who's resisting it and who's accepting. Now, what will happen is once gay marriage becomes totally acceptable, all religions will say, yeah, we always believed in that, and that was our idea. But of course, we can see right now that isn't what's happening. And that's the same I track on abolition of slavery and torture and so on. It's secular arguments using reason is what initially makes the case for why we should have this change. And so if spiritual people get on board, of course, this is great. And the less violence, the better. But I claim that it's not spirituality or religion that's the main driver. That it's, ever since the Enlightenment, the idea that you have to have evidence and good arguments for your case, or else we can reject them. That's what's been refining it slowly. So science is not just physics and biology, it's also social science.
Now, Michael, I just read a piece on the net that polled 15 scientists on what their favorite movies were, and yours was The Day the Earth Stood Still, made
Yes.
in 1951. So 30 seconds on why.
Oh, the day the earth stood still, well, it's a Christ allegory. So Klaatu comes down in the spaceship, and he takes the name Mr. Carpenter, in case viewers didn't get the analogy there, and he mingles among the common people. Then he's killed by the authorities, the government, and then the robot, Gort, brings him back to life after 3 days, and he's resurrected in the spaceship, and he delivers a message of destruction and redemption. If you don't redeem yourself, in this case, nuclear weapons.
I thought that was the perfect way to end the Sages and Scientists segment.
Is the primary driver behind pushing the arc toward truth, justice, and freedom. In fact, 4 months after Dr. King gave this famous speech, the Voting Rights Act was voted into Congress and signed by President Johnson in August of 1965. So that's some moral progress right there. But that, in fact, was just one of the latest of the rights revolutions that had been unfolding for 2 centuries. Here I track, and what I'm going to present is a series of graphs and data sets from my book. So these are the number of states that have abolished slavery and criminalized its practice. In virtually every country of the world today, it is illegal to practice slavery. We've won that battle. You no longer have to make the argument that slavery is immoral. It's just illegal. And it's still practiced in a few areas, so I have the dotted lines up there. But we've made much progress in that area. One of the reasons for this is that democracies are less likely to tolerate. So I'm happy to tell you some good news today, a few snippets from my forthcoming book, The Moral Arc, How Science and Reason Lead Humanity Toward Truth, Justice, and Freedom. The title inspiration comes from, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his second most famous speech after the I Have a Dream speech, his How Long speech. He had a series of rhetorical questions of how long it will take before we achieve freedom and justice. And as he famously said in his last refrain, not long because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So what I want to argue today, what I argue in my book, is using science in 2 ways. One, we can use science to track the fact that there is an arc to the moral universe, and it is bending toward justice, and I add truth and freedom. And that science and reason, things like slavery. And so we can track the number of liberal democracies. In 1900, there were actually 0 liberal democracies, not 1. Now there's about 118 out of the 182 countries that have full voting rights for all citizens. This is the graph of the Polity scale. The Polity Project rates democracies on a scale of 1 to 10. So instead of saying, is this country a democracy or is it not a democracy, in a binary choice, and then which you get in fights with scholars over whether it's a democracy or not, you just rank it on a scale of its openness, its transparency, fairness, how many people have the franchise, how much money influences votes, corruption, and things like that. America, by the way, is about an 8 on the 1 to 10 scale, so we're not perfect. But as you can see, so many more countries now than before are democracies. Women attained the vote in 1920 in the United States. You can see the track here. We were kind of late in coming, basically, after a number of other countries had already gotten there. But after the First World War, then there was a burst of countries to give women the franchise. Interestingly, if you see on the left there, Pitcairn Islands, the Island of Man, Cook Islands, and New Zealand. It seemed like islands were pioneering women's rights to vote. Saudi Arabia apparently will be the last one sometime in 2015, it's projected. And interestingly, Vatican City, never. That gives us a clue as to what drives moral progress and what withholds retards moral progress. How does moral progress happen? In part, it happens from great leaders and champions and people that just stand up for their rights. I introduce you here to the magnificent Inez Milholland, who I feature in my book, in her 1913 march on Washington, D.C., in which she led tens of thousands of women, and it still took 7 years after that. But there's nothing like marching into D.C. on a white stallion to make your point. In fact, women have tracked quite a bit of progress in women's rights. Here are the percentage of 25 to 32-year-olds with at least a 4-year college degree. So women surpassed men in about 1995 and have been making gains ever since. Here's the women's earnings as a percent of men's. It was 67% in 1980. It's now 93% in 2012. Here's the relationship. This is a very controversial subject. I have a whole section on what happens when you give women reproductive rights. And so as you give women reproductive rights and contraceptive use goes up, abortion rates and fertility rates go down. So I make the argument that even if you're a Christian, conservative, pro-life, anti-abortionist, the best thing you can do is give women the rights to, and access to contraception and especially education. As a bonus, populations go down. This particular data set is from